Developing learning outcomes. Here's another area of confusion. We hear goals, objectives, outcomes. What's the difference? We hear, what's a learning outcome? Why are they important? And what are the core elements of these things? We got all kinds of examples of this. Outcome, 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 outcome. Well, our workshop outcomes from this section will be this. People will be able to identify the core elements of learning outcomes. People will be able to explain how learning outcomes connect instruction and assessment. They will be able to classify the different types of learning outcomes using Bloom's taxonomy. They will analyze the core components of learning outcome statements. They will be able to design learning outcomes for their own courses and evaluate the effectiveness and impact. These are not at the level of granularity that you would see in a course because we don't have a formal assessment, so I can't say things like, given a list of 5 items from Bloom's taxonomy, students who are performing at an optimal level will be able to identify 3 out of the 5. We'll talk. So what's a learning outcome? Well, we're going to clarify another muddle of terms. There's a big mess out there. We've got goals, objectives, performance criteria, benchmarks, measurables, on and on down the line. A very wise old sage told me, she said, you know what, I don't care which one it is, just pick one and go with it. That makes sense. So we're going to pick some and just go with them. When all of these things are being used interchangeably, it creates confusion. We'll just pick some and go with it. There are some reasons why one set's different than the other. Have we seen all of these before? We've heard them said at conferences. They all start to sound like the Charlie Brown teacher voice. Wah, 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 wah. Yeah. So here are the ones I'm going to go with. The big confusion happens with these 3 terms: goals, outcomes, and objectives. This is where the really thorny stuff happens because these 3 are used so interchangeably. They're the closest. People are trying to explain a concept to us when they pick 2 out of these 3. What they're trying to explain to us is they're trying to show how we can go from the specific to the general. So they want one term to explain the specific thing and one to explain the more general language. Okay. Well, typically what happens is we use outcome and objective for the specific ones, and we use goal for the general. But then somebody had to go and screw it up, and they threw objective in there too. When you look through the literature on assessment, this is where things got messed up. We started using the same terms for the specific and for the general. For our purposes here, we're going to get rid of the term objective. And we're going to focus just on outcome and goal. You are free to be you and me. But for our discussions here, it's the concepts I'm trying to get to you as opposed to getting bogged down with the specific pieces. A goal. A goal is a statement of intended general aims of an instructional unit, course, or program. They tend to be global. They tend to be general. They use language that is general. And they are not necessarily measurable in a meaningful way. Outcomes, on the other hand, an outcome is a statement that describes what the learner is expected to know and be able to do as a result of instruction. They are specific. They are targeted, and they are measurable. So how does this look? Well, all right. I want to clarify one more piece. When we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about outcomes at a very specific level. The level of a unit or a lesson and the level of a course. For right now. There are program outcomes. We'll talk about how those things get in place. The importance of learning outcomes. Why do we want these things? They help foster curricular coherence because they help connect what it is that you're talking about and working through your students and the evaluations and assessments that they do. It helps act as the bridge between those 2 things. If you sit back before you even pick the readings and you pick the work that they're going to do, and you say, what are my intended outcomes of this next 2-week block that I'm doing? Okay, based on those outcomes, what are the best materials to select for it? It helps guide the learner, sets priorities and expectations. It's okay to give your students the outcomes in advance. I know, it's kooky. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be reading the following things, and here are the outcomes. It's not cheapening their learning. They still have to struggle through all of the stuff. They just now have a better sense of what your expectations are. That's just good instructional design. And it gets that it gets the guessing game. A lot of good research on learning showed that those of us who have funny letters after our names, yeah, you're all very smart. But you also guessed well sometimes. You were able to read faculty in a certain way that other students could, and you could guess. This is what they said was important. Why? Oh, because that's her book. I have read it. Her book was really good, and she's mentioned it 3 times. I get the feeling we're going to get tested on it. Sorry. It does happen. It helps guide evaluation. It sets a framework for assessing learning. This now gives you that instrument, those sets of instruments that you can use to assess real learning. Boy, it's nice over here. Here's a definition, people. A statement in specific and measurable terms that describes what the learner will know and be able to do as a result of engaging in a learning activity. A statement. So it's a sentence using specific language that describes that helps answer that first question we asked about what is it that we want the learner to know and be able to do as a result of instruction. So what we're going to do is we're just going to break these pieces down. Those are our 5 key areas. Statement, specific and measurable, learner, know and be able to do, and activity. We'll just unpack that. All right. So, a learning outcome, actually I want to stop. So here's a big difference now that you have this in place. A goal has language like, at the end of the workshop, participants will understand the role and importance of learning objectives, outcomes. The outcome would be, given a list of 10 statements, participants will be able to identify how each statement corresponds to Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive behavior. Statement. Participants who correctly identify 7 or more will demonstrate mastery of the topic, 70% or higher. You've set the statement, you've set the conditions of evaluation. A statement. The outcome statement needs to include the following items: the conditions, the performance, and the criteria of evaluation. So, given X or without Y are the conditions. The performance, the learner will do something. And then finally, based on that performance, what demonstrates mastery? Next, specific and measurable terms. I gave some examples here. On the left, you see the type of language that used to be, and in many instances still is, very prominent in syllabi and very prominent in departmental descriptions. We want people to appreciate something. We want them to be familiar with. We want them to understand. It's such a tough word. It's an epistemological mess. Believe. Those are great things. Those are things that we've spent a lot of time in the history of philosophy trying to unpack. Measurable terms are things like identify. You can identify a certain number of things. You can compare and contrast. You can justify. Now we start talking about, that's one that sort of falls in between the two. And demonstrate. See what happens when we move from appreciate something to demonstrating something? A statement in specific and measurable terms that describes what the learner will know and be able to do. By the way, what the hell do we want the learner to know and be able to do? What are the sorts of things we want them to know and be able to do? This is where we go back to the very classic learning domains. This goes back to Bloom, to the 1950s. We really need to update this in a meaningful way. The 3 areas that we talked about. We talked earlier about dispositions. The classic tripartite sort of thing is knowledge, skills, and dispositions. Knowing how, knowing that, and having the right attitudes towards it. Bloom took that to a slightly more sophisticated level and talked about the cognitive domain, concepts, intellectual thinking skills, Psychomotor domain, the actual physical skills and the performance of certain actions. And then the affective domain, the attitudes that Diane brought up in terms of social work. Concepts, performance, and attitude, parallel to the knowledge, skills, and dispositions group. Bloom took this a little further and said, okay, just looking at the cognitive domain here, let's set the others aside because we don't have all the time in the universe. He said in the cognitive domain, when you look into that, there are different levels to it. Those of you who've done education theory, check your iPhone. He made the mistake of calling the lowest level of his system knowledge. It was a huge mistake because it confused people even more. At the most basic level is what Bloom called knowledge, and that's just recall of previously learned material. We used to have folks in the Teaching and Learning Center, and we'd get faculty in and have them do a Bloom's analysis of an exam to see, based on all the questions that you're asking on your examination, where do you fall in Bloom's taxonomy? And we found, folks, that every single question was on the knowledge level. Just definition after definition after definition after definition. That may be useful at the beginning of a course when they're getting that foundational knowledge, but what scared people is when they looked at their final exam and they had never moved from that definitional level. Their class was a class in definition. Comprehension is grasping the meaning of the knowledge that's being learned. Application is learning how to take those concepts and apply them in a new domain. Analysis is what analysis is, breaking things down into their constituent parts. Synthesis is taking these things and combining new material into new structures. And the most sophisticated level, and it's one that makes sense when you think about it for a moment, is evaluation. We do this with doctoral students. We don't evaluate dissertations and doctoral students solely on the basis of their content knowledge. That's not what we're looking for. That other thing that we're looking for in addition to innovation is judgment. And Bloom got something dead on with that. That is the most sophisticated cognitive domain, is one in which you are able to take all of those other pieces and make judgments. That's why academic journals exist. This is where judgment is being rendered. Same thing happens with experiments. Learning outcomes and the verbs you select need to reflect these things. So when you say, the learner will be able to, here's a nice chart for you to select some. What would be a word for evaluation? What would we put in that evaluation category? Students will be able to, you can blurt it out. Perform. What else? Choose. What's a nice evaluative term? What is, aha. Yes. Judge. Determine the efficacy of one versus another. It's comparison and judgment. You start to see these categories are not all very hard and distinct. How about one for knowledge? List. Define. Recognize. Yeah. I was a public school kid. We did a lot of recognizing. Recall. Mm-hmm. So you can see now when you're starting to think about developing outcome statements for a specific unit or for a specific time in your class, you can now not only think about how to construct those outcomes, but also what are you really trying to look at with your students? Because the language that you select reflects your expectations. Words have meaning, words have power, and words have consequences. So selecting them here can really help inform you about what it is you intend to have them do, and can help inform them in terms of what the expectations are. You can now build outcomes. It's not that hard. The core elements? Well, here's one. Here's an example. At the end of this statistics lesson, students will know about concepts of mean, median, and mode. How would you turn this into a learning outcome? I know. Okay. Given a data set from Health and Human Services, students will be able to generate mean, median, and mode. Students who correctly do so for 2 of the 3 will be considered to be operating at the optimal level. Or students will calculate the mode within, boom, a certain range. You can start to get given 3 different data sets that are all on the same material, students will be able to compare the difference between the mean, the median, the mode. Once again, you can change this based on Bloom's taxonomy. What are we trying to get the students to be? No. At the end of this class, students will understand and appreciate the role of the pharmacist in the community. Well, how would you change this into an outcome? What words would you use to get away from something like appreciate? Well, students would be able to list the qualities and characteristics of a pharmacist who is engaged in her community based on the American College of Pharmacy's definition of community outreach. Students will be able to look at the analysis of a pharmacist's error rate, be able to talk about this. It's trying to move from this language of appreciate and understand and know to language that's measurable. At the end of this unit, this is a good one. Students will know about the causes of poverty in Africa. You can start to see now some of the absurdity of these. How do you measure that? And how do you honestly sit back and look at your student and say, well, no, you picked the wrong ones. Post-colonialism's not a big deal. That wasn't what we were talking about. This is an economics class. This is where we go back to what are the learning activities? What are the actual things that you're doing with your students in your courses to help them achieve those outcomes? Readings, student discussion groups, deep analysis of research papers, writing papers, taking tests, going out into the field and having field experiences. This is where all of that stuff occurs, these learning activities. And this is where, as I said before, you need to learn how to reverse engineer your instruction. Think about starting with the outcomes. Then thinking about, okay, what are the types of activities that would help students learn about this? And then what's the content? When I first became a faculty member, and so many of us did, we did it the exact opposite way. We were content first, and then everything else came second. There's some value in doing it that way. Textbook companies loved us. Here's a book. The semester's 16 weeks long, and there are 16 chapters. Well, hot damn. I got a journal article I needed to finish. I'm just 1 chapter a week. This syllabus writes itself. Outcome schmoutcome. They've got us. They had us by the hook right that day. We're just, 16 chapters. It even has the same title as my course, Intro to whatever. Those were the days. Okay. There's a lot of talk about program outcomes. How do you move from a unit or a course outcome to a program level outcome? We saw when it comes to course and unit outcomes, we're looking at specificity and we're looking at things that are measurable. Do we want that same level of granularity when we start talking about the major? But is that really going to be meaningful for you? When it comes to the program level, aren't you going to want to see aggregates? You're going to want to see snapshots and profiles. And I would assume you'd want to, once again, tailor your outcomes at that level to what it is that you're ultimately going to look at. Is it really going to be meaningful for you when you're sitting there talking about your major to have things along the lines of, given the list of 10 compounds, students were able to identify 7 of them? No, but what you'd want to see is, what are the scores from the courses in which they had the following concepts? So when it comes to program level outcomes, you need to take that step back up. They start looking more like goals. The way we demonstrate that our students are able to think critically about the field is that we have the scores from the following 3 assignments that have been averaged out that are looking at specific components of critical thinking: critical literacy, critical writing, and critical analysis. We picked 3 from 3 different courses. That's how we are able to say they understand critical thinking. That's how we operationalize that definition. So the goal with program outcomes is to try and take the specific learning outcomes from individual courses and use them as the operational definition. We are doing a good job of helping our students know about critical thinking if they are performing at a certain level on these 3 assignments from 3 critical junctures in our course. If they are performing below that level, we need to have a conversation. If they're performing above it, we want to do some more research to see why they're doing such a good job. Obviously, it's because we're awesome. That's that level up. You need those course level and unit level outcomes to give you the data to help you come up with that operational definition, but you're going to kill yourself. You're going to be dying the death of 1,000 paper cuts if you want that type of data all the time at the program level. You need slices of it.